Well, some of you are familiar with the old golf story about the two faithful golfers who played together almost every Saturday morning for 35 plus years. And they're playing one morning, and they playing by a road near the hole, and came up toward the green. And all of a sudden, there's a funeral procession going by, and the one takes off his cap, puts it over his chest, stands there for a minute before attempting his putt. And his partner says to him with such awe, boy, I've played with you all this time, and I've never seen you do that. It's very, very touching to see the way you treat this funeral procession. He says, well, she was a good wife for 32 years. I think Jerry really likes that story. But actually, in our culture, I think probably one of the last courtesies of our public culture that kind of have preserved for, I don't know how long time, has been that kind of sense of giving deference to funeral processions. I know that most of us probably have been in one at one time or another, maybe a short one, 2-3 cars, maybe a long one, over 15 to more cars. And certainly if we haven't been in one, we've certainly seen them go by, or sometimes been inconvenienced by them. And we wait as the light goes green, red, and it's not our turn to go because we're letting this procession pass. It's an interesting phenomenon, yet I think in our culture that we still recognize that most of the time. Certainly, I've had different feelings about it, as have all of us probably over the years. But as many of you know, my dad died 2 weeks ago, and it was the first time in a few years that I'd been in a procession. I'd certainly attended many funerals in between, but to be in the procession even though it was just probably about 1.5 miles or 2 to the cemetery, it wasn't one of the longer ones, but to go in that procession is an interesting experience. I think it's interesting from a couple points of view. One, usually it happens after you've had a fairly intense experience of a funeral celebration, and people have been at their Sunday best as a rule. They might have had a few laughs with a story or eulogy, but generally they've been filled with tears in church or remembrances or prayers or whatever else is evoked during that reminiscence or recognition of a person's life. And there's the solemnness. And then you get this little break of the procession, and you go out to your cars if you're in that. And some people who are smokers, finally get to calm themselves with a cigarette smoke, or somebody else gets to take a swig of water these days, or whatever else. And the conversation kind of goes toward something else in the car. You could be commenting on the service, on what the minister said, on what the family said, on the music, on the flowers, on who knows what. Or you might comment on something else entirely. Just what a dreary day, what a beautiful day, what a day it is. And then you get to the cemetery again, and everybody puts on their solemn hats again, usually at the time of a burial. And I'm just kind of observing it as it's close to me, and thinking, it's just these different moments that we need a kind of respite or break from some of the intensity sometimes, and then we're able to enter into it again. And then oftentimes afterwards, of course, people are able to come together in some kind of gathering that involves food or drink, and again, a happy time. Interesting rhythms, I think. And I bring that all up because of this funeral procession in Nain that Jesus kind of got into in a weird way in today's scripture. And in those days, in the time of the Jewish people, of course, in this small village, I think what I had read is an estimate of possibly 2,000 people at best in this village, and they didn't have internet. Why? They couldn't communicate how does somebody die and when are we going to bury them and things like that. And of course, with the Jewish custom, as a rule of burying someone the same day, it's most likely that this younger man died that same day. And the family gathers together within minutes, hours, and says, we got to bury him. And so the procession begins to form. Word spreads to the others, family, kin, whoever else, and people gather, and the wailing starts. And the wailing wasn't just an expression of grief, although it was certainly that, an expression of affection. But it was also almost like a call to prayer, they say, that you'd be wailing in the streets so that people would come out and notice, hey, we're burying somebody. Get in line, come along. So you've got this procession gathered around this young man who's died. And, of course, the key element is the fact that they bring out that he's the only son of a widowed mother. And that was bad for her. Not only the loss emotionally of a son, child, but the whole financial basis. As we know, there was no Social Security, and the implication is that there's no other family to help her. And we know that the references throughout the Scriptures to care for widows and orphans is often made because they recognize that a widow had very little means of sustaining herself usually. And this widow apparently was one of those like that, with no other means of sustaining herself. So this is not just a sentence, obviously, of loss, but it's one of destitution. So you got this procession forming. And then, on the other hand, you've got Jesus and his apostles, as Gary read to us. It says he approached the gate of the town. His disciples and a large crowd went with him to Nain. And I'm not sure why they went there, but they were going there. So you got a crowd coming one way and a crowd coming the other way. And this crowd with Jesus is kind of probably a relatively celebratory or raucous crowd. They're listening to this preacher that's a new face on the scene. And they're buzzing about, what's this guy about? What's he going to do? What's he done? Is he the one? And in this little tiny village, less than a village, probably Hamlet-sized place, you've got these two crowds, and you can imagine that clashing on the street. They turn the corners. I mean, I'm just imagining this, of course. But turn the corners, and boom. You've got this wailing crowd here, and this crowd with Jesus here. You've got the powers of death and the powers of life. The power of hope and the power of darkness. And it's a clash. But it isn't really a clash. It's a clash of the powers. But what happens? Well, as the gospel writer sets it up, Jesus goes forward. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her. Compassion. One of the greatest words in the English language. One of the words that in the Scriptures, the Greek is written in Greek. This word is written 12 different times in the New Testament. And it's a really long Greek word, which I didn't remember from my Greek, which was a long time ago. But looking it up in one of the commentaries, it was something like phlagzeninomai. Phlagzeninomai. It's a great word. But compassion meant being moved in the belly, being moved in the guts, being moved in the bowel, where the emotions resided in primitive thought. This verb meant Jesus was moved in his guts. And this word is used The occasional other times that it's used in the New Testament are either about Jesus being moved at the sight of the lepers, or a couple other miracles, or in the story of the prodigal son, or the story of the Good Samaritan, where these main characters are likewise moved with compassion. Their guts react. We've all had that experience at times where our guts react to someone's suffering. We just kind of are so engaged. Perhaps we don't know what to do with it, but we're nonetheless engaged on a gut level, as they say. And that's what was happening with Jesus. He got engaged on a gut level with these people. And you can imagine the crowds mixing. Perhaps they knew each other, perhaps they didn't, who knows. But it's like, we got to do this burial, and we're going to do something else. Maybe hear Jesus preach, who knows. But the point is that he kind of breaks through that with the power of life into the power of death and says, "Do not weep." Touches the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he says, "Young man, I say to you, arise," as the story goes. And he gets up, begins to speak. And Jesus gives him to his mother. It's a purposeful resurrection. It's a resurrection that's not just meant to restore the life of this young man, obviously, but to restore the life of his mother, to give her a sense of hope and sustenance again as well. It's interesting. It's not just for himself. Resurrection, in this sense, is not just a personal quality or a personal offering or gift or promise. It's saying it's for a purpose. You're going to be resurrected. And I think we graft onto that. We're resurrected. We trust and hope and whatever that next realm is, not just for ourselves, but to be part of a grander scheme of things, a grander purpose. Jesus resurrects this youth for some reason, in addition, not just because life is good, but because he can therefore be instrumentally helpful to his mother. So, this is wonderful. It's a great moment. And the crowds recognize it. And they say, a great prophet has risen among us. And after this, the Luke story is when it goes into then the apostles going to tell John about this. Wow, you don't know what we've seen. This is really incredible. He resurrected this guy. So it's a moment of compassion. But if I were the church lady, as some of us might recall from Saturday Night Live years ago, one of the great characters of Dana Carvey years ago, we might say, isn't that special? Great Jesus did that. If you could do it then, why didn't you do it now? If you could do it with this widow's son, didn't you have enough other people that died that you met that you could do it for? If you could do that then, what about the wars of history? As an aside, maybe some of you saw the great play, An Iliad. Anybody see that? A few of you did? Yeah, I saw it at Syracuse stage. It was kind of a blow you away type tour de force, where this man enacts, in a sense, the Iliad, and he recounts for about 5 minutes the wars of history. And it's just like you're staggering back listening to the killing. It's really quite overwhelming. But the point I'm getting at is more Jesus, saying, okay, why do we have these kind of episodes in the Gospels? What are they meant to be? What are they meant to do? Not just to show that Jesus is divine. That's special. But it's meant to say something more, I think, obviously, about compassion and about what does it mean to feel and to do. Now, some of us are more touchy-feely than others. Some of us maybe are more easily moved in our guts and bowels than others. But that's not what the essence of about, even though I think that the word is interesting that way. But it's about, okay, what does that inspire us to do? Whether or not it's from a thinking base, feeling base, it's from a human base, it's from wherever we're at that we react with compassion. Compassion, suffer with, as we know, the Latin roots of that word in English, cum passio, with suffering. We can identify with suffering, compassion. And that's what we're called to do. I just want to recite a couple of things in this past week where I could be aware of that compassion. Different people. My friend Tom Slater from the food bank celebrated his retirement. Tom brought that institution along to be the institution, not just him, of course, but he certainly was a compassionate force to bring that institution to what it is today, in a national model of food distribution and healthy ways of dealing with that issue. Tom is a person of compassion. Mary Mall, a good friend of mine at Contact, who lives with multiple sclerosis, 24 years teaching people the skills of listening on the phone, dealing with suicide. I think there's a couple people here who know Mary. Talk about compassion. Talk about exuding compassion, teaching people how to listen with compassion. They dedicated the telephone counseling rooms to her the other night, and I got to attend that event since I'd worked with her, and we've stayed good friends for many years. Bill Redfield, our friend, the Episcopal pastor at Trinity Church, who is retiring from Trinity and now moving on to a new ministry at Wisdom House, which was endowed by a former deceased parishioner friend. And this Wisdom House movement that he is starting, that I'm sure Plymouth formally and all of us informally will be invited to be part of. Bill, likewise, a man filled with compassion who's let that go on and grow. These are people in the news, a little bit, at least in my news. But the ones who I want to mention, too, persons with compassion, here. Because I want to mention especially some of the aides that attended to my dad at Iroquois Nursing Home. Many of these women and some of the men many are immigrants. Some speak somewhat limited English, and they're from a variety of countries. And the care that they extended to him, the kind of little things they would do, even when they didn't know we were there. I can remember once a few months ago or so coming in to a visit, and the door was open, of course, and just watching the aide for about a minute before I announced myself, kind of attending to him and kidding with him and calling him Teddy, and just the way she was tender with him. Compassion. Obviously, I can look around this congregation at so many of you, whether it's folks involved with the different ministries, the food bank, the various ways people reach out here, public servants like Gene and others, and say, this is what Jesus was showing us, this kind of compassion. We're not going to raise people from the dead, and he's not raising many these days that I'm aware of. But the symbol, sign, token of that action was that's what it was about, I think. That's what the raising of the widow's son is about, saying, be compassionate. I don't know how you're going to do it. You're going to do it your many, many, many different ways. Some very publicly, some very privately. But it's compassion. Enter into your own compassion. And God will use you. The great German mystic of the 13th century, Meister Eckhart, one of the mystics that when I read his reflections yet leave you just kind of stunned. Where do I go with this? One of his great sayings was, "You may call God love, you may call God goodness, but the best name for God is compassion." And I love that saying. I love that saying. Another one of Eckhart's, God only expects one thing of you, and that is, insofar as you are a created being made in God's image, let God be God in you. Let God be God in you. Compassion. So, as we think about this funeral procession and this raising from the dead, that's great. It was an incredible moment. But it's the compassion that endures. And perhaps the next time you are in or stopped by or even frustrated by a funeral procession, you might recall the clash of those powers of darkness and good. That clash that says, how can I exercise compassion today? How can I feel the compassion of God? What's the token that I'm going to bring forth as I witness this and recall this incident from 2,000 years ago? We are meant to be people of compassion. Amen.